Thank you for staying on, and In Focus continues now. The Communications Worker Union says the South African Post Office is planning to go ahead with the retrenchment of 6,000 workers. This after the entity suffered a 2.3 billion rands loss in the 2020-2021 financial year, with revenue declining rapidly. This could see the number of employees drop from just over 16,000 to a little over 10,000. The Communication Workers General Secretary, Aubrey Tshabalala, joins us now for more. Aubrey, good evening once again, and thank you very much for your time and joining us tonight here on In Focus.
Good evening, Thabo, and good evening to the viewers.
Why has the Post Office failed to, I suppose, fulfill its dual mandate? One, of universal access. Maybe one could argue that they could have done well there, or maybe they are doing well there. But the second one is self-sufficiency, which I suppose is why we're having this conversation.
Well, there's various reasons, Thabo. Remember, dating way back in 2007, we were the ones that marched to the public protector's offices complaining about corruption. That's the first part. But the second part is that the government interventions on policies bottleneck the business of South African Post Office. Well, you move forward now, fast track to where they completely take away the Post Bank from South African Post Office. Now, South African Post Office, by that move, is owing Post Bank over 2 billion rands. So all these interventions and also opening up the market for open for all, whilst bottlenecking in terms of pricing and all of that, it makes a sufficient space for private sector to thrive, whilst your own SOE has been locked down in terms of those policies. So this could be some of the factors that comes to play. But having said all of that, is that Post Office has not been stable in terms of management. We've always had acting CEO, acting this, acting that. And that have led to non-consistency. And as a matter of fact, we couldn't have a turnaround strategy that was going to be implemented, that was going to talk to the ICT issues like technology interventions, cybercrime, and all of those things that will make it respond swiftly to the marketing demands.
Yes. So from what I'm hearing you say and what I hear the CEO say, your analysis of what the problem is pretty much similar. I mean, it's on par. She maybe dates it back a little bit earlier. She says since 2004, there have been losses at the post office. That's where the problems start. There is, of course, the protracted strike that happened a couple of years ago, saying that certainly had its impact. He says there's a question of labor brokers who had 8,000 people actually on their books. And when that structure was dissolved, those 8,000 had to be absorbed. But according to her, these are people who had no work and had to be absorbed into the post office. The courier freight workers who also had to be absorbed, saying there've also been then some sector changes, which you are mentioning, like digitization and so on and so forth. The Post Bank issue is one issue as well, where the Post Bank took the reserves after having been part of the post office. And then, of course, there's COVID. When you look at all those issues, would you say that is the sum total of why the post office is in trouble?
Not really. You know, it's so easy for people to quickly blame workers. You must acknowledge the fact why were workers striking in the first place. It's because there was a massive corruption where post office moved from its own offices and went to, rent on lucrative buildings. Why workers were on strike is because there was an influx of labor brokers, which was a modernized slavery. Workers were exploited, and all of those things factors in. But centrally to this thing is that if you talk about the company did not make profit, you must remember what I've spoke about earlier on, that there was pricing regulations. And around 2007, and I make it deliberate around that date, is when the government stopped its subsidy to post office, but continue to say you cannot increase the price. The idea is good, but you have to subsidize that so that the poor can have universal access, as you were saying earlier on. But now what we have seen is that post office have been moving from their own buildings into shopping malls where it's very expensive even to pay the rent. And ultimately, most of the post office were closed down. Who suffers there, Thabo, is the poor of the poor. So in some areas, we can agree with the CEO. But in this decision to dismiss 6,000 workers, almost the entire bargaining working force, it's a hasty decision, it's not been thought through, and it will make her own strategy fail. Because that strategy needs to talk about the workforce that you need to upskill to be able to deal with issues of IT and various other areas. So it means that there's concerted efforts in our view, particularly from the state side, of making sure that you collapse post office and make sure that the private sector emerge from this crisis. And that's where we are as we speak.
So in your view, you share the view and the opinion that says universal access should be funded by government. And you're saying government is not funding that universal access. And that, in a sense, is what is hampering the post office from carrying out its other mandate of being self-sufficient.
I share a view, but we also say the state must invest. Remember, there's a number of businesses that post office should have been operating on. One of the things, if you remember in the olden days, there was this blue book thing, which our parents used to send each other's money from rural areas. The same process is the one that is used by the likes of ShopRite checkers and so forth. It's just that the technology changed and the government did not invest in that process. We see the issues of issuing of passport, issuing of IDs is being given to multinational banks at a higher rate instead of investing in your own South African post office, which can deliver, which have a greater network. Now, this thing of cutting jobs does not assist because you are keeping that network that South African post office have an upper hand on. But what does it mean also to those workers? Remember, these are the workers that their medical aids were not paid, their pensions not paid, their tax not paid. So when you throw them into unemployment space, you're actually entrenching poverty, which is contrary to what the president was saying a day before they issued this letter at the SONA, where he said that we are driving an economy that will be inclusive, we'll have to take everyone along, including workers. But what happened the next day? The entity under the state is doing contrary to that.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit in a moment about the business model, but let's go back a little bit more on this question of the turnaround strategy. The first leg of it, the CEO saying, was, of course, to reduce the high cost of doing business. So cut costs, reduce losses. And they're saying at this particular point, well, every element, of course, they're still cutting, but there's a large part of the elements which they have cut, and you will tell me if this is so. But they're saying the next part, the next leg is staff cost reduction, which they're really saying it's unavoidable. Part of the strategy is that employment costs right now are 68%, and they're saying this is unsustainable. So there've got to be costs that are cut there.
Well, not necessarily. First and foremost, we were the ones that asked for auditing in terms of the staff itself. If you look at the numbers of post office, I heard you were saying 16,000. They are now talking about 14,000. They are not even so sure who are they paying. That's the first point. And we want to drill on that particular matter. Secondly, when you talk about staff reduction, in many areas in the outskirts of South Africa, post office uses what we call the delivery agencies, meaning that they hire people on a daily basis to deliver because there's a lack of staff. If you go to many depots in South African post office, you'll see that workers are not actually fully capacitated. But yes, in other spaces, you find that there's more surplus of workers than what is required. So in that space, what you need firstly to do is to set up your HR first. Make sure the people that you have is the right skill. Make sure that the people that you have are located in right places. Then the second space is that to say, when you say that there's too many people in post office, what do you mean? Because we still struggle. If you look at the queues of paying grants are excessive. If you look at various other issues, we are always offline and so on and so forth. Those are areas that we have to look. You cannot kill production to save cost, because when you do that, you're actually killing business. What must happen is that they must pay the debts that were created due to corruption, most of them, and they must pay the debts that were created on workers themselves, because up until you speak now, workers' salary increase were not fully paid in 2020. So there's a series of debts. So we want to reject everything else that seeks to say, for us to save a business, we have to kill workers, we have to retrench workers. There's no fact in that. In fact, we have to create more jobs, because the digitalization of the postal and courier has actually created opportunities for South African Post Office to grow. Amongst others, now there's a shopping online. Who do you deliver those things at the doorstep of every consumer? Yeah. It's supposed to be South African Post Office, and it's failing in that space.
So you are saying the encroachment of courier companies can be dealt with by policy. So in other words, you're saying government has come up with policy that is starving private companies in favor of the post office.
Sometimes when you talk about government, you actually, in Zulu you say, basically, there's no progress, because there is a legislation that says 0 to 1 kg is exclusively for post office. But to this day, all private sectors are delivering zero. Uber Eats, amongst others. But we are saying, because already those companies have created jobs, already those companies are now doing business, you cannot shut them down. But they should be given a license by South African Post Office so that it continues to generate profit. So we have a state here that has some of the policies that are good, but failure to deliver on them, because there's no monitoring, there's no accountability, there's absolutely nothing. So workers found themselves in this crisis because of those challenges. So yes, there's greater prospect for post office to succeed. And that's why you have many people in the private sector who wants to buy post office, because they can see there is potential. All what you need is proper management, is proper governance, is proper board and accountability.
So let's talk to the business model then. CEO saying the logistics, warehousing and the e-commerce space is where the post office can still thrive and operate with the number of international clients that it has. However, it needs to be in a smaller size.
Well, I'm not so sure. You can't grow business smaller. You have to expand. I'm not agreeing here on that part. One of the things that the government have done is taken away Post Bank. The best practice internationally is that all post banks operate on 3 segments: is the mail, is courier, and the financial services. Once you take out the financial services, you weaken the strength of post office. So one of the things that we are championing is that it was a mistake to remove Post Bank from the post office, because we are creating that vacuum and it will strive to do well. That's why she's talking now about shrinking its ability. So you cannot do that. But 3, we must remember, Thabo, in a context of a developmental state, the South African Post Office must deliver services to its people. And one of those people is the poor of the poor. And once you try to urbanize post office and kill it completely at the rural areas, we are actually failing that obligation of universal access. So we must never forget about the mandate of that particular institution. Yeah. So we must not be driven by profit at all costs, to a point that the poor are sitting at the back of the financial chain.
I suppose that's where she says you need to customize to respond to the needs of your clientele. In other words, as you put it, you mentioned the Blue Book, for example, earlier on, saying customers in rural areas would probably benefit more from that kind of service or that revenue line more than probably customers who are in urban areas. And therefore, the one-size-fits-all business model could be at fault here.
Absolutely, I agree. And again, it's not new. If you go back in the days, when you go to deeper rural areas, you'll remember that some of the time post office will use tech shops that were there in the rural areas as their agency to deliver the letters. So it's not necessarily a new idea. It's been there, but we have gone beyond that as a trade union. We have said that the poor elders who are suffering from chronic disease, we must make sure that we deliver their medicine at their doorstep rather than them to stand in long queues and die in the queues waiting to get that services. We have raised a number of issues around that. Post office have a greater opportunity to service our people. Yes, I fully agree. One size fits all does not work, but of course you need to look at the demands from region to region and in terms of the rural areas and so forth. So it is important that we do. In the recent years, when we're talking about the COVID-19 vaccine, we've said that the post office have an opportunity. You don't have to erect tents or marquees for people to receive their vaccine, but you had post office that was standing there to deliver that, which is an institution of government, which should have done better. And that would have actually benefited post office to strengthen and revamp its own infrastructure.
You're raising concern about the post office not having followed its own processes when instituting this process of a Section 189. How are you going to challenge that?
Well, Thabo, you know, when we are dealing with a management that is not decisive, 2 weeks ago I was here talking about 40% salary cut. Whilst we are discussing that, we receive a letter that says 6,000 to be retrenched. And of course, we are not yet sitting in the meeting. In that meeting, we're demanding a number of things that they should put on the table. The finances, how much is the executive earning, and so on and so forth. And where are these workers located? How do we deal with the issue of upskilling, a number of things? So the post office have not responded to that. They come back now and say, look, we have to go Section 189. So there's 2 processes in Section 189. You will go to CCMA, you can deal with it legal route. You can even take action in terms of a mass mobilization. And if you have looked into what the community of Mitchell's Plain in Western Cape is complaining about the closure of post office, the community in the Eastern Cape is complaining about the closure of post office, it means that it's not a workers only problem. It is a national problem where it involves communities. So when we are going to talk about mass mobilization, that will be also included.
Aubrey Tshabalala, as always, I appreciate your time. Thanks so much for coming on and outlining those issues for us. That's Aubrey Tshabalala. He's with the Communication Workers Union. He is the General Secretary there.